First, let's just remember this is not the first time that Ukraine has used an ATACMS to strike radars. Most of the times they are doing this, it's in Russian-occupied Crimea or inside of the Russian-occupied lands of Ukraine or very nearby the border. So this is nothing extremely new, unless if this radar system was deep inside of Russia, or what we would call deep in this conflict, then that's a very different thing. And that's kind of one of the policies that we want to have addressed. In general, Russia is beginning to feel the brunt of a growing capability inside Ukraine to strike more deeply in Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're joined by former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Philip Breedlove. In his 39 years military service, he's also held positions including Commander US European Command and Commander US Air Forces in Europe. He's a regular commentator on the war in Ukraine for us, and it's great to see you back, General, on Frontline. Welcome. President Zelensky has presented his victory plan to President Biden, and both presidential candidates. Permission on long-range missile strikes into Russia remain elusive, and we're facing all-out war in the Middle East and winter coming to the battlefields of Ukraine. How do you see the outlook for Ukraine at the moment?
Well, if we just looked at the performance of the Ukrainian military and what they're doing, you would, I think, conclude that the outlook is good. Ukrainian military is affecting change on the battlefield, et cetera, et cetera. But then if you begin to consider the policy support to Ukraine and the Western policies that, in my opinion, severely limit Ukraine's ability to fight this war, then it's a little bit more concerning. And you and I have talked about this before. I'll just sort of preempt a little bit by saying that I still believe that the number one thing we need to give Ukraine is better policy.
Yes. Just in terms of developments at the moment, the Ukrainian military is reporting to have used ATACMS ballistic missiles to strike a Russian radar system, destroying the NEBO-M radar. Can you tell us a little bit about how Russia uses this system and how high value the target is?
First, let's just remember this is not the first time that Ukraine has used an ATACMS to strike radars. Most of the times they are doing this, it's in Russian-occupied Crimea or inside of the Russian-occupied lands of Ukraine or very nearby the border. So this is nothing extremely new, unless if this radar system was deep inside of Russia, or what we would call deep in this conflict, then that's a very different thing. And that's kind of one of the policies that we want to have addressed. In general, Russia is beginning to feel the brunt of a growing capability inside Ukraine to strike more deeply in Russia. We in the West forbid Ukraine from using Western kit to strike deeply into Russia. And the United States even imposes its will on nations like yours, the United Kingdom, and not allowing them to use Storm Shadow and other things because of American components in those missiles. I personally think this is a horrible policy, and it is resulting in real problems for Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine now is building its own capability to fire into Russia, and they're beginning to take the attack to Russia. You've seen some amazing film of the recent strike against the large Russian ammunition depot and striking against aircraft and airfields in the rear. So the radar systems like this one we're talking about are a part of a network that Russia is trying to use to defeat Ukraine's ability to strike deeply into Russia.
And you even signed an open letter recently demanding that Kyiv be granted permissions to strike deep into Russia with these Western missiles. President Biden has been criticized as being weak for not doing so. And some analysts argue that tactical gains would not be decisive to warrant the risk of this retaliation. Do you think that those kind of strikes can then, I mean, you cite the ammo depot being struck, do you think they could be decisive?
Well, the word decisive carries a lot of
Yes.
connotation. What is absolutely true, I know, is that using the ability to precisely strike uniquely military targets on the Russian side of the border is key to any military campaign that Ukraine would run. We would never limit a Western force from striking the enemy before the enemy can come to bear on us. We are now forcing Ukraine to allow Russia into their area before they can strike them with Western weapons. It's absolutely crazy. And you can get pundits saying anything you want, but you're not going to find too many military thinkers who have commanded at senior levels who would share the opinion that we should not allow Ukraine to strike the enemy before the enemy can bring his forces to bear on Ukraine.
It,
It's absolutely crazy.
it's interesting that Israel's allies have now twice come to its defense against Iranian missiles. Is this likely to have any influence on the justification for the limitations imposed on the way Ukraine defends itself?
I don't think so.
Absolutely not.
Sadly, we in the West, NATO, and certainly the White House are deterred by Mr. Putin. The most effective weapon that Mr. Putin has used in this war is his war of words, his war of intimidation. Every time things start to go bad for Russia or America considers doing something to help Ukraine, immediately there's a flurry of new policies about nuclear weapons, new policies about the use of nuclear weapons, threatening to use nuclear weapons, nukes, 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 nukes. And also, there is a flurry of conversation about this war will widen. And of course, once again, American soldiers are going to die on the battlefields of Europe. And so Mr. Putin's war of intimidation is succeeding wildly, especially in my capital. And we are limiting ourselves in this response. And I see this now beginning to bleed over into Israel. We see people already, our own president, talking about Israel should not attack the nuclear program of Iran, trying to limit Israel's response. And in the first round of firing into Israel from Iran in the spring, Israel was attacked by 110 or so ballistic missiles. And the West, and certainly the United States was leading, convinced Israel to moderate their reply. And Israel went back with a very small reply. So did it work? No. Now
Uh,
Iran has attacked with a larger group of missiles. 181 is the number most people are using. It may have been more. So Iran was not fazed by Israel's initial response. We'll see what Israel's response will be this time.
so as President Biden comes to the end of his presidency, how would you judge his record on foreign policy?
So I hate to do politics in public. You know that. I will just
Okay.
say that we in the West, and certainly we in America, have acquiesced in the interest of not allowing this to become a broader war, or in not allowing this to become nuclear. So, what has the world learned? What has Xi Jinping? What has the leader in North Korea? What has the mullahs in Iran learned? If you threaten the West, if you threaten America with nukes, they will back up. And so at some point, we in the West have got to establish what is the stopping point. I wouldn't use the word red lines because we have backed away from red lines many times. But we have to determine at what point we need to reestablish the deterrence that we have lost. I'll say that one more time. We need to reestablish the deterrence that we have lost.
Just to focus a little bit on the battlefield situation in Ukraine, how much importance do you attach to the apparent fall of Vuhledar in the Donbass? Russian troops have been trying to capture it since the full-scale invasion, but it's unlikely to lead to any significant breakthrough for Russian forces, is it?
It's more symbolic than anything else. I read a startling number yesterday. I don't know yet whether I should believe it, but the Russians have lost over 8 times the population of Vladivostok in Russian soldiers to take it. The cost to Russia to get to this city has been immense. Some of the best estimators, I think, are actually from the UK about what the losses for Russia have been in this war. And now I'm hearing as many as 650,000 dead or severely injured in this war. The cost to Russia is immense. The drain on the manpower in their industries is starting to show as they are unable to do things they need to do industrially. And pretty soon, Mr. Putin is going to have to answer to the mothers, fathers of Moscow and the surrounding cities for the loss or the complete decimation of 650,000 plus soldiers. I don't know how my country could ever do that.
Taking into account everything you've just outlined, how long do you think that Russian forces can sustain this meat grinder approach to warfare?
Sadly, to be intellectually honest, I think they can do it for quite some time, because as long as Mr. Putin has the iron grip on the people and those who control the people and all of the media and all the ways to speak to the Russian people, it's unlikely that it's going to change drastically. I do agree. I do agree with those who say, that the recent sort of breaks in the glass or cracks in the glass are important. What happened with the uprising and the defeat of the uprising, and what they're doing with their contract troops, and who's in charge of the contract troops, the various organizations. It's not a perfect world for Mr. Putin, but he still seems to show an ability to absolutely control the Russian people.
What do you think is the biggest challenge Ukraine is facing this winter? Is it keeping the lights on? Is it maintaining the front lines, or keeping the political support on board? That's
The
the last
biggest
one.
challenge is what is going to happen in Western capitals, and what is going to happen in the U.S. capital across the next several months. Again, I don't like to do politics, but either outcome in America could be problematic for Ukraine. On one side, it may be a continuation with a little less support of sort of current trends. On the other side, I don't know. I don't want to start rumors or anything, but it appears that the other side is ready to capitulate, to get a stop at all cost in the fighting, a ceasefire. And so right now there's no real clear outcomes in either camp that I think are going to be really helpful. So I think the toughest battle across the next several months for Ukraine is, does its international support go away? Do we capitulate to Russia as a way forward?
And that debate, and the only debate by the US vice presidential candidates, it didn't give a single mention to the war in Ukraine. What was your reaction to that, and why do you think that is?
Well, I think I think that that's to be expected. I think while I am a person that is concerned about foreign affairs and how the world is going, elections in America do not turn on foreign affairs. Elections in America turn on abortion, inflation, social programs, et cetera, et cetera. The things that are closest to home and closest to the table are what truly affect elections in America. Foreign policy is pretty far down the list. Now, this year, they may rise a bit because you have, again, what everyone's talking about in America. You've got this sort of trio of huge challenges coming on our country right now. You've got the continuing war in Ukraine and foreign politics and Israel. You've got the dock workers strike, which are going to cause prices and inflation to go up in America. And, we've got the continuing concerns about just inflation, economy, price of food, et cetera, et cetera. And so the next president will face some severe challenges. And one of those challenges will be of a foreign policy bent. And right now, again, there are many in America that look at the foreign policy approach of both sides and they're concerned.
And that point that Democrat candidate Kamala Harris made, that reaffirming US support for Ukraine, saying it was in the US's strategic interest to support Ukraine. Obviously, from what you say, and we know it doesn't chime with everyone in the US, but why is it in the US's strategic interest? What do you say to people if they don't seem interested?
So if you look at how the U.S. entered World War I and how the U.S. entered World War II, learned authors who write about these run-ups to the war and how it all happened almost universally conclude that the delayed entry of the United States into the war increased American dead, increased European dead, increased the impact to the world economy, increased the impact to the U.S. economy. And so what we see is that isolationism, trying to just stiff arm problems because we're on this side of the ocean and others are on the other side. This approach has almost always hurt America more in the end game. We are uniquely connected to Europe. Half of the world's GDP between us, almost all of our, not all, but a huge portion of our ancestry, our businesses, our values, all of these things are connected to Europe, embodied in NATO, frankly, if you'll allow a former NATO commander to say that. But we are uniquely connected to Europe. And if we allow Europe to get in trouble, we will be in trouble. If Europe's economy suffers, our economy suffers. If we allow a nation that is wanting to become democratic and separate itself from the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union model and days, if we allow that nation to be overrun by an illegal, immoral, inhumane leader and war, then all of this will shake out bad for the United States. And so I believe that we need to be proactive in the way that we approach our support of things and matters in Europe. Yes, we all sort of disagree. And frankly, yes, what I learned as the SACUR is every nation thinks about itself first. It was only 28 when I was there, but you could guarantee first discussion on anything, there were 28 national positions. And so we have to remember that we truly are stronger together when it comes to Europe, and we can't allow a war in Europe. And that's what we have. Oh, by the way, we have a war in Europe. We can't allow that to go on without being involved and find ourselves in the same way we were in World War I in World War
In
II.
that light, how optimistic are you about what the new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte can bring to NATO and to Ukraine?
So I'm always optimistic about NATO. It's the right thing. It's going to be more important in the next 75 years than it was in the last 75 years. And NATO will move forward. I don't know the gentleman. I'm sure he's very good. I'm sure he's very good. May I just say that he has been given a base from Jens Stoltenberg that is absolutely superior. I'm a bit biased. I was invited to be a part of giving him a leadership award in New York just recently on the margins of the UNGA, and got to interview him after he got his award in front of the crowd. And Jens Stoltenberg has done a magnificent job for the European alliance of NATO. And so I think that the new SecGen is going to start from a great place. And yes, he will make new impact on the alliance. I expect only good things.
It's understood that part of President Zelensky's victory plan is to be formally invited to join NATO. Is there any way of redesigning the accession process or the membership criteria so Ukraine can? No. He's saying no. He's saying no.
Yeah, I want that to happen, but I don't
Yeah.
think it's going to happen.
Not in a time of war.
It's even I don't even place it on that, and I'm going to be a bit accusatory here, but remember that Mr. Putin's main goal in life is to drive cracks in NATO, and then like freezing water to break those cracks further and further apart. And right now we have a couple of countries that find themselves very closely aligned with Mr. Putin. And those countries are being adamant that there's not going to be membership for Ukraine in NATO. And as long as Mr. Putin is able to control people and use them in these kinds of arguments, it's going to be really hard to bring Ukraine aboard. The great nations of NATO will have to find themselves in a position where they have to bring their unique pressure to bear on these sort of Putin verstayers who are in NATO, and then maybe we can move forward. So it's really about the politics first, not what's going on in Ukraine. Yes, we'll have to get some sort of resolution to the conflict and settle the lines, whatever they're going to be. But first and foremost, we have to recognize that Mr. Putin has huge influence on several people in NATO, and that's a problem we're going to have to deal with.
So we'll just have to wait for that irreversible moment in the future and keep our fingers crossed for the time being, I guess. You have spoken to me and been very critical in the past about the West's failure in deterrence over Putin's Russia. And you mentioned it again today when it invaded Georgia, when it annexed Crimea. What do you think is the West or NATO allies' blind spots right now, either over Ukraine or wider global threats?
Well, I'd like to use a sort of a parallel from my life raising children and now helping to raise grandchildren. In 2008, the West's response to the invasion of Georgia was inadequate. And we ended up allowing Russia to hold on to 20 to 25% of the great nation of Georgia. And so we rewarded bad behavior in 2008. In 2014, Russia amassed its army, marched across internationally recognized borders, and has occupied and is attempting to subjugate portions of Ukraine. In 2014, the West's response was inadequate, and we ended up allowing Mr. Putin to hang on to between 12 and 13% of some of the most important commercial parts of Ukraine. So for a second time, we rewarded bad behavior. Now in 2024, after 2 years of the most horrific, I said it before, inhumane, inhuman, illegal warfare, there is a movement to once again capitulate, reward Russia for bad behavior. So back to the original premise, here's what I know about children and grandchildren. If you reward bad behavior and you reward bad behavior and you reward bad behavior, you are not going to get good behavior in the future. What Mr. Putin has learned is that he can take a portion of a neighboring nation, threaten nukes and wider war, the West backs down, and now he moves on to his next objective. At some point, we're going to have to do something. I'm not a historian. Forgive me if I don't get the reference perfect. I believe it was Stalin who said, when you approach your enemy, fix your bayonet, press your bayonet into his belly. If it is soft, push further and harder. If it is hard, pull back and reconsider. I would offer that 08, 14, and now 24, Mr. Putin has found us to be soft, and he's going to continue to push.
So as you see things today and assessing all that you see and know, the information available, how do you think the war in Ukraine must end in order to not reward bad behavior?
Well, again, we want to do what the Ukrainians want to do, I think. It's not our job to determine what is the final outcome in Ukraine. It has to be the Ukrainians. And I believe that the way the West has supported Ukraine by giving them enough not to lose, but definitely not giving them what they need to win, we are sort of wanting Mr. Zelensky to realize he's going to have to go to the table. The West is not intellectually or morally capable right now of considering a defeated Putin and what that means. And so we are, I think, waiting for Mr. Zelensky to determine what are acceptable negotiation terms. And so at some point, Mr. Zelensky and the people of Ukraine will probably come to a point where they determine how that future shapes out, and then we'll end up negotiating. I think that it's important to remember that in a military sense, for Ukraine to be viable, we've said that many times in America, we want a Ukraine that's whole and viable and blah, blah, blah. If Ukraine is to be viable into the future, in a military sense, we think of two things that have to exist. We have to have an environment of security, and we have to have rule of law. If we don't have security or rule of law, investors are not going to come in. People are not going to bring their money and their business to Ukraine to try to recover it. Because if they don't think there's going to be a secure environment, why am I going to invest billions in a factory? If we don't think there's going to be rule of law, why would I put my money into anything? And so I think that we have to make decisions in the long run about security. There has to be a guarantee of security, and there has to be rule of law. And just before I finish this, I know I've gone long. Remember that the West has given Ukraine a guarantee of security in the past. If you go back to the Budapest Memorandum of 94, 4 countries said, you give up your nukes and change your military orientation, and we will assure your borders and your sovereignty. That was the US, the UK, Ukraine, and Russia. How are we doing so far? Russia invaded. US and UK have done a lot. We have to be thankful for what they have done, but they have not assured the borders and the sovereignty of Ukraine. Those are both still in the balance.
How do you provide that security, those security guarantees for Ukraine, though, while it's still waiting?
NATO.
Until it joins NATO?
Well, before NATO, then we just have to continue to do things that we have said. In the United States, actually, our verbiage has changed. in the last 6 months. We've actually heard our two most senior military leaders, the SecDef and the president, use the word that we're there until Ukraine wins. That's a completely different paradigm than we've lived in. But again, if I go back to my childhood, here's what my mother used to say: people don't care what you say, they watch what you do. So we have said now that we're going to support Ukraine to win. We're going to have to change our support to Ukraine to allow them to win, all the way back to my first remark in this session, and that is we need new policy.
General Breedlove, it's been great talking to you. Let's talk again and keep an eye on this. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.